The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Where do you see the whole car industry going? And then I guess that's a question where I'd like you to also expand on where you see the government regulations and restrictions going in the car industry as well. I mean, are we getting to the point where the government is just going to regulate out internal combustion engines and we just have to go to electric cars? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, they've effectively done that. That's already in process. But to start off, I'd like to talk about where I see the car industry going, and it's not something that you have to be a prophet to predict because they've actually been rather explicit about it. They are talking about no longer selling cars, but selling, as they put it, transportation as a service, selling mobility. And what they mean by that is it's an implicit admission that cars are becoming prohibitively expensive. The typical new car alone now is 6 years, going on 7 and even 8 years. It's a reflection of the fact that people simply can't afford them anymore unless they stretch the payments out so far as to make them doable. The problem, of course, though, is you can't do that forever because of depreciation with vehicles. After about 5 or 6 years, the value has plummeted to such an extent that in many cases, the vehicle's not worth what you still owe on it. And banks aren't stupid. They know how to do math, and they're not going to make loans on these vehicles because they know a lot of people are just going to say the heck with this and walk away from it. The car industry knows that too. So what's the solution? Rather than do the rational thing and say, wait a minute, we really ought to think about making cars more affordable, what they want to do is get everybody on this payment plan. And you have a subscription to a vehicle. You tap an app on your phone and somehow poof, like Genie from My Dream of Genie, your vehicle shows up and you get a ride, you get taken somewhere. That's I think what they see as the future. And that gets us into this whole electric car thing. The government is making it impossible almost from a regulatory point of view to continue building any car that isn't at least a hybrid, if not a complete electric car, via the so-called zero emissions requirements, and also by just upticking the mandatory mileage minimums to the point where if a manufacturer wants to sell, say, a truck with a gas engine and that truck gets 25 miles per gallon in an environment where the government says all your vehicles you have to sell have to average 50, well, how are you going to do that? You're going to do that by incorporating a bunch of hybrids or electric cars so that you can combine the two and meet that 50 mile per gallon standard. Problem is most people don't want the electric cars. They're not very salable, even though the media wants you to think that this is like some big phenomenon. Most people don't want electric cars. They still constitute only about 1% of the vehicle fleet. Very unlikely it's going to rise unless they force people into it. Well, they're going to offload the costs onto the remaining IC cars. And then I think what they're going to wind up doing, because they're going to have to do this, if they really want to get everybody into an electric car, they're going to make it economically impossible for people to continue to drive other than electric cars by jacking up the prices, by jacking up registration fees, by increasing gas taxes, all of these things. And it's almost a fait accompli right now. You've got the regulations that are already in the books. You've got the Biden administration talking openly about all of these things. And the auto industry, unfortunately, has committed to it tremendously. You may have followed this whole thing over April about Volkswagen calling itself Volkswagen.
Yeah, right.
VW is just one of several car companies that have stated that after a certain date, 2025, 2030, they're not going to even build any more cars that aren't electric cars, notwithstanding there's no market for them because they're so preposterously expensive and they are so functionally gimped relative to non-electric cars. The whole thing is just completely batty.
So how does Volkswagen propose that they're going to do this and why? If they're that difficult to make, if there's that low demand, are they just assuming that the engineering, because that's the pushback that you would get from people who are like Tesla fanatics, and more power to them, but they would say, well, the engineering capacity is going, or capabilities are going to catch up by 2025, which is going to bring down the price. And since electric cars have fewer components, then you can buy a brand new electric car, let's say for $10,000 in 2025 or 2030, because the engineering will get to that point. What's wrong with that idea?
Well, they've been saying that since I've been covering the car business since the 90s, and it hasn't happened yet. And they're being either dishonest or they simply don't really know what they're talking about when they talk about the simplicity of an electric car. It's true that an electric motor is simple. However, electric batteries and the management systems that are necessary to safely charge, recharge, and keep that whole system operating are orders of magnitude more complex than the systems that are necessary to govern the operation of an internal combustion vehicle. And you think about the shock, the road shock, the extremes of temperature, all of the things that a vehicle out on the road has to deal with, and the prospect of one or several things going wrong with this apparatus is pretty high and pretty expensive. And you want to talk about the forbidding aspect of repairability and the cost. There's nothing more expensive than that. Good luck. And there's so many facets to this. These things are also inherently dangerous. Lithium ion batteries, the nature of those batteries is such that they are prone to thermal runaway and fire, which happens sometimes if they're charged excessively, if they're jostled, if the construction materials aren't exactly right, if there's deterioration. It's not like a gas car where you have to, first of all, you have to have the liquid gas has to somehow be exposed to a spark before there's a fire. With these batteries, if the internal materials come into contact with each other, if there's a short, which could happen, for example, in an accident where the battery case is damaged, it doesn't have to be a spark. The thing creates fire in and of itself and burns. But of course, nobody seems to care about that safety aspect because it's politically correct. That's the kind of thing that we're dealing with right now. It's no longer facts, logic, and reason. It's about politics, emotions, and feeling.
All right. Is that why Volkswagen is kind of making these statements? Are they just pandering to their local politicians to kind of gain political favor? Or
Volkswagen got curb stomped badly. You might recall the cheating scandal with its TDI diesels. And it's actually quite an interesting story because Volkswagen was the only major car company that was selling an entire lineup of affordable diesel-powered vehicles. You could get a Jetta, you could get a Golf, you could get a Beetle with a TDI diesel that could get 50 plus miles per gallon on the highway for around $23,000. And these things would go 700 miles on the highway before you stopped for 3 minutes to fill up the tank and get back on the road again. And because they were diesels, these things would go 300,000 miles easily without any major repair. Well, that was kind of a problem for the electric car agenda, I think. And I think that's why Volkswagen was so viciously curb stomped over cheating on government federal certification tests, not the emissions tests that you take when you take your car in to get registered or get your registration renewed. You go down to the gas station, they stick the little tailpipe sniffer in. There was no problem with that. This was a federal emissions certification test. And the amount of cheating was literally the angels dancing on the head of a pin kind of cheating. A fractional difference in emissions under certain conditions of a particular compound called oxides of nitrogen. No harm was ever actually established. What the harm was that it defied the authority of the government. And I think, in my opinion, it represented a threat to the electric car agenda. Anyway, Volkswagen was treated in an unprecedented manner by the government over this. I think the total of the fines was something like, it was in the many billions of dollars. I can't remember the exact number, but it was enormous. And part of the settlement was that Volkswagen had to put on the hair shirt, had to fund electric car ads, had to fund, you may have heard of something called Electrify America, where they're going to be putting up all of these so-called fast charging stations all over the country. Well, Volkswagen is paying for that. Volkswagen was chastened. Volkswagen was put in the position, remember 1984? Remember Winston Smith, where he was tortured in room 101 by O'Brien? Yeah. Well, Volkswagen has come to love Big Brother after having dared to question the orthodoxy of the party. So now it has decided that its future is to do exactly what the government says. So now it's come out with the ID4. That's its first mass market product. And this is a vehicle that costs $40,000 to start and has a best case range of 260 miles before it has to stop to be charged. And that is a best case half hour to 45 minutes if you can find what they like hilariously style a fast charger. Yeah. I wrote an article, I titled the article Regression, and contrasted this car with what the TDI Jetta offered as little as 5 years ago. So here you have a vehicle that is roughly twice as expensive, the ID4, as the diesel-powered Jetta, goes less than half as far, and that somehow is something we're supposed to clap about. That this is an advancement somehow. How is this going to benefit the average person? It makes absolutely no sense to me unless you've drank a couple of bottles of MD 2020 before you start talking about it. Remember MD 2020?
Oh yeah, Mad Dog 2020. You bet that a 40 of Old English.
Yeah,
that's right. That takes you right back to college, man. That's for sure. I was going to say they're definitely mixing that MD 2020 with some Kool-Aid.
By the way, and
for
to
sure.
continue on this Volkswagen thing, it's absolutely a tragedy. But as the scandal was breaking and the media got all over this because they just love this sort of thing, Volkswagen had been working on a diesel hybrid commuter car, and this thing would have gotten 260 miles per gallon on the highway.
Wow.
And if it had been mass marketed, its platform was very similar. Remember the Honda Insight from the late 90s, that little
Yeah.
two-seater?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Very
kind of like
similar
a
in
Prius.
look and layout to that, except using a diesel hybrid combination. So this is something that Volkswagen probably could have brought to market for around $25,000 or so, because there's nothing particularly elaborate about the technology. Hybrid technology has been around for a long time. Diesel technology has been around for a long time. Can you imagine that? Essentially a free transportation once you bought the thing, 260 miles per gallon. You know,
Yeah.
and if they really did care about the well-being of Americans, and if they cared about the well-being of the planet, 260 miles per gallon, virtually nil in terms of the emissions produced by an engine that gets 260 miles on a gallon of fuel, as
Yeah.
opposed to these energy hog electric cars, which may not produce a lot of carbon dioxide at the tailpipe, but you bet your bippy they produce it at the generating plant, which uses coal, oil, and so on to generate the electricity necessary to power these things.
Yeah, that's a great point that most people don't understand, is they think that if you have a diesel or even of a diesel hybrid, that it's going to blow like black smoke out the tailpipes like a 1970s Peterbilt or something like that. They don't understand that the emissions from those diesels that Volkswagen was making, and I would assume that diesel hybrid would be basically cleaner than air that you would breathe in most urban areas, minus the cars. I mean, it's just
Absolutely.
it's so minuscule, the amount of emissions or carbon dioxide output.